was your school like when you were in elementary school? What was your school like?
What was my school like? The teacher's intentions were for you to learn. And you had to learn. You had to make those grades.
So they wouldn't let you just...
And it wasn't just a gentle talking to you. Back then they used a capital punishment, which was tanning your hide.
Let's see. What were your parents like?
What now?
Your parents, what were they like?
I still didn't understand
What were your parents like?
what she said.
What was your parents like?
The best.
The best?
They were the best. Religious people. Worked hard. They couldn't have been beat. And I loved them dearly. In fact, my father was a miner. And he broke down his health and the injuries that he had received in the mines. He broke down and I had to drop out of school and go to work in the mines to support my dad and mother. And I took care of them until they died. My father died right in my arms. And I watched the last breath go out of my mother. Kept them in my home. The rest of their life.
How often did you all go to church?
Pardon that.
How often did you go to church?
Did I do what?
Go to church.
I'm having trouble understanding.
I know this fan's making a lot of noise. She asked how often do you go to church? Did y'all go to church?
I go every Lord's Day, Sunday.
Every Sunday?
I haven't missed a day since I was baptized. And I should have. I lived a long life in sin, and God had been very merciful with me and very patient with me. Because I come so near dying different times, and I wondered what He was saving me for. And His patience is something that I give thanks for every day.
So, who all's lived in the house, this house? Like,
Always
tell
in
me
this
about it.
house?
Mm-hmm.
No, I lived in several different houses. I bought this place in 1940. I bought it myself. Worked the money out in the mines and bought it. I kept my father and mother right with me. I've got a little story I can tell there. And back in that depression, in that so-called Hoover Depression, people were almost starving in this country. There was no money in circulation. And I worked for a lady that owned this property. When I was 14 years old, I worked for her a whole day for a bushel of mashed potatoes for us to plant. 8 years after that, I bought the place off her, the farm. I like that story.
That's a good story.
I sure do.
What was your first job?
Pardon?
Your first job?
My first job, coal mining.
Was it?
I worked in it until I was crippled up so I couldn't go back in the mines. Was paid a total permanent disability for injuries that I received in the mines without litigation, without a lawsuit.
Right.
I went 6 years that I started doing carpentry work and masonry work. And I worked at that just from job to job locally for about 6 years. Then I started at the hospital, one of the hospitals that the miners built.
Right.
United Mine Workers. I worked there 20 years. And the old injuries that I had received in the mines broke down on me, where I'd had surgery on my back. It gave way on me and I had to retire, but I had worked there 20 years.
So, what do you remember about President Roosevelt?
Pardon?
President Roosevelt, what do you remember about him?
What do I remember about him?
Mm-hmm.
One of the greatest men that ever lived. He was a Democrat, I'm a Republican. But I recognize the man for what he was and for what he did to this country. This country, the mines have been closed down. And the camps, the coal camps, where the people that moved away were even nailed up, the doors and the windows. And weeds had grown up between them. It was just a desolate looking place. And when he was elected, these mines opened up, started hiring people. And it seemed like it was just a new birth of life. And that was through that so-called Hoover Depression, you know. He followed President Hoover. And that depression was named after Hoover. The United Mine Workers, working in these mines was just like slavery. Even when I started, the wages, shift wages paid $4.86 a shift. Being young, I would gripe, you know, go on because we weren't paid more. The old miners would always say to me, son, you don't know what you're talking about. We work for $2 a day. And through the efforts of the United Mine Workers, it's built up to where it is now. And I've been very, very active in the United Mine Workers. It's been my life. Even the big strike that they had in Virginia and in Tennessee and part of Kentucky. Although I would say I was about, I must have been somewhere around 78 years old, maybe 80. I went through that whole strike on the picket lines in Tennessee, Kentucky, and I felt that I owed it to them. I had received so much help from them. And through the Miners Welfare Fund, they had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on my wife because she was an epileptic, you know. Had her doctors all over the country, and the Miners Welfare paid for it. And since I retired from the hospital, they have spent that kind of money on me. Surgery 4 or 5 times. And I've got nothing to say about them but praise.
How old were you when you first got married?
When I first got married, I was 21 years old and a half. Married in 1939. And our first child was born. We were married at 6 o'clock in the evening, and our first child was born at 6:30, 7 years later. I'm going to add that. 7 years later, we'd reached the point where we didn't think we were going to have any children. And my mother, being old and wise, and an old mother and grandmother, she told me one day, she said, Daniel, Oprah was pregnant. I said, Mommy, what makes you think that? She said, I know. Been watching. And our first born was Danny, my son. He works in Washington, D.C., works in the Labor Department, or in the Justice Department. He calls me 2 or 3 times a week. And we managed a fishing trip twice a year through their marriage, or through his efforts and the foster son. That was Noah Lee. You've met him.
Yeah. So, what's the best piece of advice you think you could give somebody?
Pardon that?
The best advice you think you could give someone?
Live a good, clean life. Don't be taken in by some enterprising boy. Get a good education so you can earn your way through life and you won't have to become a mop lady. That education really means it. Don't smoke. Don't drink. And associate with people that you can learn from. Don't associate with someone that knows less than you do because you will not learn anything from them.
All right. Well, I think that's got it covered.
Is that it?
That's all. Thank you, Papa. You can.
Well, I can even tell you about my grandfathers and even tell you about my great-grandfathers.
Would you tell me a story about one? Could you tell me a good story?
I can tell you a story about my grandfather and grandmother that you take a good writer could write a heart-rending story about them, their devotion to one another. He died in that, right at the end of that flu epidemic. She prayed to die and go with him, and she did. And they made the coffin large enough that they buried them together. That's something you hardly ever hear.
What year was that?
Pardon?
What year was that?
I think that was in 1922.
1922. Wow.
Now I've got my great-grandfather's picture and his wife's picture in there.
Really?
And you want to look at it before you leave. His name was Bob Johnson. My grandfather's name was Scott Johnson. And they originally came from North Carolina when they were all migrating west, you know. President Johnson, he visited this country when he was running for president. And he made a speech over there at Paintsville in Johnston County. That's not far from here, you know.
Right.
And he said he had taught school in a little one-room schoolhouse. And he said, we are the same Johnsons. Said part of you stopped in Kentucky and the rest of us went on to Texas. But we are the same Johnsons. And, oh, he was quite a speaker. Now, they were pioneers. They lived close to the earth. In fact, he killed the last wild bear that was killed in this country in his lifetime. I didn't have much of a chance at a formal education, but I studied a lot. I read a lot. And when my children came along, naturally, I developed an interest in schools, in education. I was first elected as a president of our local PTA. Then I was elected as our high school athletics association. And then I was elected to the county board of education. And then I was elected as chairman of the board. And I served 4 years on the county board of education. And let me tell you, I can't imagine any more difficult position to serve in than to serve on the Board of Education. Because you have parents that are unreasonable. Regardless of what their child does, it's all right with them. And some of those cases would end up before the board. And now I'm not able to take part in none of that, but I got plenty of time to think and to study. Just the things that I would do if I was back in serving in that capacity, I've held every office in the United Mine Workers on a local level, including president. I served about 3 years shortly ago with a local reunion in Pikeville, Kentucky. That's about 50 miles from here, and it was pretty difficult for me to make that trip, And I finally resigned. They offered to pay me a salary. I wouldn't take it. I wanted to rebuild the local union. It had gone down to nothing. And they offered to pay me gas mileage. I wouldn't take that. I served for no compensation at all. And was glad to do it.
Do you have any other questions, Kate?
No, I think that's it.
Now my grandmother on my dad's side was a Fleming. And my grandfather's mother was a Brown. That's as far back as I can go with my dad's people. No, I don't know too much about my mother's people. All I know is that my grandmother on my mother's side was a Bentley.
And still, what, 1800s or 17th century? 1800 and something when your grandparents?
That goes way back in the 1800s.
Yeah.
My grandfather and great-grandfather.
Yeah. That's awesome.
One of my great-grandfathers, Fred Fleming, he was my dad's grandfather. He served in the Civil War. And they gave him the name of Fighting Fred. Now they attended a big ceremony down here. He was buried in this cemetery down here at Hemphill. The first man buried there. And the day that he was buried, my dad was born. So he was born there. He was buried there April the 8th in 1878. when we attended this big celebration that they put on down there in his honor. Now, he served with the Confederacy. I thought that I would probably be the oldest great-grandchild, you know, but there was a woman older than me that was a great-grandchild.
All right. I'm going to stop it there for you, Kate.